Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we'll be looking at Jerusalem in the days of Jesus in our ongoing survey of ancient history as a framework for the Bible. If we look at an overview of just the terrain around Jerusalem, now what you see in the outline is the modern day walls that date back to the Crusader period, but the city of Jerusalem was surrounded on three sides by valleys. On the east side you had the Kidron Valley, making its way where it joined up to these other two valley systems. As you move toward the west, you have the Tyropoeon Valley. It gets its name because that refers to the Valley of the Cheesemakers. I believe that's Latin. And then moving westward, I finally come to the Hinnom Valley. Notice on the south all these three valleys merge and they form a wadi that flows all the way down to the Dead Sea. Looking at a cross-section of the same area to the east, I have the Mount of Olives. Notice that I've got the Kidron Valley, and then the Temple Mount, as well as the, if you go further south, you've got the old city of David. And then moving uphill, notice that at a higher point, even than the Temple Mount, I have the western side of Jerusalem, where sits today the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, not the western wall, but there's a western city wall. And then the Hinnom Valley. That was the valley which had served as the town garbage heap back in ancient times and had given rise to the picture, since they were always burning trash. And every time I've personally been in that valley, they've always been burning things too, although it doesn't look like a trash heap anymore. It's been reclaimed. But the Hinnom Valley became a byword of the day, where if you wanted to refer to hell, you could talk about the Valley of Gehenna. And actually that's redundant because the Ge part in Gehenna means valley. So the Valley of Hinnom, or Gehenna, is how you say it in Hebrew. Now we're looking at a model of the city of Jerusalem. The model itself is in Jerusalem, but I think it will help us to visualize the city. Notice I can see the temple up in the upper right-hand corner, Herod's temple. But first, let's begin with David's city. This is the oldest part of the city. This is the part of the city that's built on a narrow ridge on the east side, that is on the right as I'm looking at it. I'm looking from south to north. I can see the Kidron Valley and then the Tyropoeon Valley on the west side, on the left-hand side of David's old city. Underneath that city, back in ancient times, and it was still there in Jesus' day, whether they were using it or not, was the tunnel that had been built by the men of Hezekiah, Hezekiah's tunnel. And in Jesus' day, you could follow that tunnel. I'm not sure if anybody was still doing it, but water still flowed through that tunnel. And on the south end, it came out near. Now this pool here is what's called the Pool of Siloam, but that's not the pool that was there in Jesus' day. This is a later pool that dates to the Byzantine period. I merely followed that same flow of water about 50 yards to the south of that pool, and I come to this pool that was only discovered in the early 2000s. In fact, this is right after they had uncovered it. That's my wife in the background talking to one of our guides. And this pool was there in Jesus' day. They've not fully excavated. Only a small portion of it has been excavated. These steps led down into the pool. This was the Pool of Siloam. Here you can see an artist's rendition of what that pool would have looked like back in the days of Jesus. And on our map, on our model, here's where the Pool of Siloam was thought to have been, although to be quite fair, they did not correct the model when they found the actual pool. Now it's in the same area, but it might have been a little bit further to the east within the model. That is within the site of within the city of part of David's old city. Now as we go back to that model and we move to the west, we go from the old city of David to the lower city. And it's lower because it's actually lower in altitude than David City or what's going to be the upper city. But this was the poorer section of the city of Jerusalem. Backing up so that we can get a bigger view, now we take in the upper city. This was the newer, the richer section of David City. It was here that some of the palaces, like the Hasmonean Palace, were located. It was here where you would have had the homes of people like Caiaphas and Annas the high priest. And it's very possibly here were the, according to tradition at least, where the Last Supper of Jesus was held. Now, you can go to a place over on the west side of that upper city and you find what's today called David's Citadel. It was not called that in that day and doesn't really have anything to do with David. It was just named after him. But this was the location of one of the towers. Herod the Great had built 3 towers. One was named after his brother Faisal, one was named after Hyrcanus, and one was named after Mariamne, his wife. That was said to be the most beautiful one. And this is the base of one of those towers. Near to those towers was a palace that had been built, the Hasmonean Palace, and of course it had been thoroughly refurbished by Herod himself. Another view of the Hasmonean Palace. While we're talking about palaces and fortifications, and we can still see those statues of, or images of those 2 towers in the upper left, far in the background, but in our foreground we have the Antonia Fortress. The Antonia Fortress overlooked the temple itself, and this had been built by Herod and named after his patron, Marcus Antonius. We know him as Mark Antony. I come around to the east side of the city of Jerusalem and I have the Eastern Gate. Now the gate that you're looking at dates to the Crusader times, but it is located on top of an older gate. Let's see a cross section. And the reason we know this, not just from tradition, but also a tomb eroded away, I guess after a thunderstorm. There was some rainwater and it caved in, and when folks went to repair it, and they did, but they looked down into the tomb and they could see the very top part of a gate that was visible in the tomb. So that told them that the arch from the old Herodian gate was located beneath the current day Eastern Gate that we see. There's again a cross section of the same view, that Golden Gate as it's known as, with the tomb, and showing some of the levels of stone that had been exposed by that erosion. Now if I look out across the Kidron Valley to the other side, I'm going to see the Mount of Olives. It's much higher than the Temple Mount, and it's from there that you can get a very commanding view of the entire city. On the lower slopes of the Mount of Olives, of course it's called Mount of Olives because you had olive trees there, and there's a little olive tree garden in that area known as Gethsemane, which means oil press. Coming around now to the western wall, very familiar to us. Around the Temple Mount, you had a number of entryways into the temple complex. There was not only one entrance; there were a number of them. We're looking at the model that shows the western wall, and one of the bridges, in fact, probably one of the biggest bridges that you had, that led up to across the Tyropoeon Valley, a stairway leading up and up into the temple area. That same arch, only a portion of it remains. Robinson's Arch is the name that it has been given, named after its discoverer, modern-day discoverer. You can see the arch, the angle of the arch, and how it would have looked in that day. And of course, this was the lower portion of the arch. Up on top of that would be where people have walked, and that gives you an idea of how much higher the walls were in New Testament times. That is, you can look at this wall, you can see the very large Herodian stones in the center of our picture and down below, and then the higher you go, the smaller the stones. Those are the later Crusader stones. That's a much later period, but the original stones went much, much higher than either one. Again, another view of Robinson's Arch and the rubble that still remains down below it. Remember how Jesus said that not one stone would be left upon another, that it would all be cast down. It was down here that has been noted. I'm standing behind a stone. Actually, it's a replica because the original was hauled away into a museum, but you can still see the replica there. And there's an inscription right by my left hand that says in Hebrew, it says to the place of trumpeting, which seems to have indicated that it was here that one of the priests would go every morning to sound the shofar, the trumpet, as he looked to the east and would see the first rays of the sun beginning to shine over the Mount of Olives, that he would sound the trumpet, marking that it was now the time for the morning sacrifices, followed by the morning prayers. You remember also that Satan takes Jesus up to the pinnacle of the temple. It might have been this place to which he was taken with that temptation. Throw yourself off the pinnacle of the temple, and your angels will the angels will be sent to catch you up, lest your foot be dashed upon the stone. Of course, Jesus doesn't do that. Now we come around to the Western Wall, a very familiar sight to anyone who has been to Jerusalem or even seen pictures of the city of Jerusalem. Here's our model showing that same Western Wall, although the portion that you see when you actually go there is shown in that square. That's what's visible today. It originally went much higher, but it also went much lower, because gradually over hundreds and thousands of years, the land has moved up and portions of that wall were knocked down. So you only see a small portion when you go there today. Let's go back to the Western Wall. You can see those large Herodian style stones throughout most of our picture. At the very top you see some smaller stones. Those are the Crusader walls. Likewise on that wall to the left, those are later stones. That's not the Herodian stones. It continues to be a place of prayer for the Jews. Over on the right side is the place where it's been sectioned off for the women to go and to pray. And in that women's section, I want you to note on the far right of that, there is a very large stone. This was the lintel, let's mark it off on our sheet, of an ancient gate. It's been called Barclay's Gate after its discoverer. The building that you see on the right wasn't there in ancient times. And that gate just shows you, only the very top part of the gate remains, it shows you how high the surrounding area has risen and how much is covered up by just the ground sediment. Here on our picture again, let's look at where that gate would have been located. Barclay's Gate, or as it might have been known back then, Coponius's Gate. And on our model, to show that gate assembly and the stairs leading up to it have long since been buried. Now I have Wilson's Arch on the right side of the Western Wall. I can go through that arch. Let's do that. We're going to walk into and through Wilson's Arch. On the inside we'll see a place that's still used for prayers today, especially when there is inclement weather. And there's a place where the archaeologists have dug a shaft. I'm standing under Wilson's Arch, and I'm pointing the camera down. And I'm looking at how many levels, how far that wall continues to go below ground, the present level of the ground, 60 feet down. As I continue going north along that western wall, I come to still another gate. This gate, and notice all these gates took you up into, not just onto the Temple Mount, but through the Temple Mount, through stairways that would lead you up onto the Temple Mount itself. I'm continuing my traverse going north along the western wall. And I'm coming to some of those stone foundation stones. In this case, here's a stone that goes for maybe 20 or 30 feet. That's the sheer size of this is just so immense. Giving you an idea of what the walls, and of course that shaft continues to go north, gets a little rougher the further you go, a little bit narrower as well. And we come to Warren's Gate. This is buried deep within the present-day Jerusalem, but still another gate that led you up into up onto the Temple Mount. And finally, I've come full circle, and I want to bring you now to the south wall of the Temple Mount, because this was the main entrance to the Temple Mount. Looking at our model, you notice we have two gates. Now that's going to be corrected. More recent discoveries, they built that model. It's a great model, but they haven't corrected it as they've continued to find new things. You go up the steps of the mount, and on your way up there you find a number of what they call mikvot. Here's a mikvah, a place of washing. Now if you go there today, there's not running water, so it wouldn't really classify as a place where you could do that ceremonial washing. But in ancient times, there were water channels that brought running water to these areas where you could, the Jew, before going into the up onto the Temple Mount, he would pause, the worshiper would pause, and he would cleanse himself ceremonially. And then after that, he would go through one of the Huldah gates. We have 3 on the right and 2 on the left. They've been blocked up, so you can't go through them today. But you would go up through these gates. And on the other side, you would find yourself on the Temple Mount. Notice our model only has 2 and 2. It should be 3 and 2. But I have those gates in the background. And you would come out. Behind you would be the great portico that was named after Solomon, Solomon's porch. Solomon didn't build that. It was built by Herod the Great. And you'd find yourself on the Temple Mount. That Temple Mount, as you came closer to the temple, and that's the first thing that you would see, was surrounded by a low wall, punctuated by gates every so often. At each one of these gates, written in both Greek and in Latin, were warnings that if you were not Jewish, you were not allowed to go past this point upon pain of death. Now I'm going past that, just because we can do so on our model, even though, frankly, I'm not Jewish. I go through the Gate Beautiful, and in the foreground, I find myself in the court of the women. It's because it wasn't just women that were allowed here, but women were allowed into this portion, and they could go this far and no further. There were 14 steps leading up to the bronze Nicanor gates. We see this in the center of our picture. And women could go that far, no further. And then just beyond that was the court of the men, and then the court of the priests, and then the temple itself. If we go there today, we see still, remember the temple was on a mountain. And so still at an elevated section, I'm on the Temple Mount looking at the highest part of the Temple Mount. That's today the Dome of the Rock. It's a Muslim mosque. Now, I've not been inside the dome, so I'm getting this picture compliments of National Geographic, but if we were allowed to, we would see, the reason it's called the Dome of the Rock is because at the center of the dome, there's a large portion of the bedrock that is visible. Here's another picture of that bedrock that you can see inside the Dome of the Rock. It's here that not just the temple, but the Holy of Holies would have stood right here. I come out of the Dome of the Rock. Of course, I have the Mount of Olives in the distance. The slopes of the Mount of Olives was found this cave. It contains a number of ossuaries, those boxes. Imagine this tomb. There was, on that flat spot that we see in the middle of our picture, a body would have been laid, and then the body resides there. The tomb is shut up and remains shut for a number of years, and then maybe after a year or two, some of the family go back into the tomb. They roll the stone away, and they gather up. The body's now decomposed, so they gather up what's left. That's just the bones, and they place the bones into one of these boxes. These are bone boxes, or as we call them, ossuaries. Some could be very simple, some could be very ornate, and you might have, because remember, tombs, they take some space, and Jerusalem was short on space by now. A lot of people living there, and so I can have an entire extended family buried within one tomb. One of such ossuary was found, very ornate ossuary, belonging to evidently somebody of very high status or very wealthy. On the side of this ossuary it says Yosef ben Caiaphas, and Caiaphas was the name of the high priest that officiated at the trial of Jesus. This seems to be the ossuary which belonged to him, and certainly the ages of the bones that were found there matched the age of Caiaphas. We're told how old he was when he died. Josephus gives us that information. I want to talk a bit about Pilate. Pontius Pilate and his conflict with the Jews. Pilate had had some rough dealings with the Jews both before as well as after the trials of Jesus, over which he officiated. There had been an issue when he had come to Jerusalem with Roman soldiers, and of course Roman soldiers were always carrying their Roman military standards, their Roman eagles. And the Jews saw that and they said, "You're bringing idols into Jerusalem." And there had been a riot and a number of people had been killed. On another occasion, Pilate was short of funds. Remember, his job is to collect taxes for Rome, and so he had gone into the temple and had stolen the Corban money, that is the money that was set aside from inheritance and inheritances to be given to the Lord. He had said, well, that can go to me instead, and had stolen that. Again, a riot had broken out. On still a third occasion, there had been a report that treasure had been found on Mount Gerizim, and of course, if you say treasure's found there, everybody and their mother's uncle showed up trying to dig up the buried treasure. Pilate took this as a sign of a revolt, and he marched in there with troops and killed a bunch of people. So there'd been a number of these sorts of conflicts. Eventually, Pilate would be recalled to Rome, where he would stand trial and would be deposed and banished. Aside from the various historical accounts that tell us the story of Pilate, there's only one actual archaeological piece of evidence that shows he even existed. This was a monument that has his name. Notice part of it's broken off, and it does specify his name. It was found in Caesarea, which goes to show that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Just because, if they hadn't found this, it wouldn't have meant that that Pilate didn't exist. There's ample evidence to show that he did, both from the historical record and even in this one very small inscription. Let's talk about the crucifixion now. The Romans used a variety of means when it came to crucifying someone. Wood was, especially in Israel, tended to be in a bit short supply, so they probably would oftentimes make use of pre-existing things. If you had the trunk of a tree that was already there, as shown on our right side, and even branches perhaps might be used. But the scriptures make mention of him being placed on a cross, and so maybe that with a combination of one of these others, where you would have various sorts of Roman crosses that were used to crucify. In each case, notice there's a plaque that's mentioned that's put above or alongside the accused, indicating what crimes had been committed by him. The biblical account tells us of Jesus carrying his cross, so it wasn't just a tray. on which he was placed, but he would carry, at the very least, the crossbeam. Although we're also told that at one point he was so weakened by the treatment he had already received, the savage beating at the hands of the Romans, that another man, a Simon of Cyrene, was drafted in to carry the cross for him. We also have a record of the plaque, the sign that went over the cross, that it was written in 3 languages, in Hebrew and in Greek and in Hebrew, Greek, and probably Latin. Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. And of course that could be rendered a variety of ways, and probably was. But the area in which Jesus was crucified was so metropolitan, so trilingual, that 3 languages were needed to make that statement upon the cross. We only have within Israel one actual archaeological relic of a crucified person. Now that's not to say this was not the crucifixion was rare. Actually, it was rather commonplace. We're told that at the fall of Jerusalem, Josephus says, there were a ring of people all around Jerusalem. It was literally surrounded with crucified people. But we only have one actual relic, and notice in this case I have a wrist bone with the nail going through the wrist, and I have the bone of someone's foot, but the nail was put not in what we think of as maybe a traditional way from the top of the foot, but actually went through the heel. No matter how it's done, I'm sure it's going to be just excruciatingly painful, and I'm sure that was the case here. Now, the location of the tomb. If you go to Jerusalem today, what your guide will probably take you to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It has a very ancient tradition back in the 300s, when the mother of Constantine, he had become a Christian, and maybe she already was, or at least she became a Christian, and she traveled to Israel, and she asked around, where was Jesus crucified and buried? And the folks that were there told her this was the place, and she had a church built on top of this place. Now, the church that you see there today was built on the ruins of that church, because it's been through some, destruction and rebuilding, but it stands there today on that same location, signifying the place where supposedly Jesus both died and was buried. If you go into that church today, it really doesn't look anything like it would have in the first century. There's this massive colonnades and things like that, and they take you to this narrow area where they say this was the place of his burial, the sepulchre part. Elsewhere within that same church, notice under that glass you see part of the rock face of the top of a ridge, which they will tell you was Golgotha, and maybe it was, but it's hard to see any of it today because it's been all overloaded and built up with surrounding church and tiles and things like that. You don't get a sense of what it would have looked like in that day at all. Maybe it's for that reason that in the 1800s a British Army officer by the name of Gordon went around the city, and he came to this place on the north side of the city of Jerusalem, and he said, gee, if I use my imagination, maybe it sort of reminds me a little bit of a skull. Remember, the word Calvary or the Hebrew Golgotha means, those are words for skull. Now, was it named that because it looked like a skull, or because somebody had done something with a skull there? We're never told in the Bible which is the case. If I look, going back to our model of Jerusalem, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was fairly close to the Hasmonean Palace, where the trial of Jesus would have taken place. That trial would not probably have taken place in the Fortress Antonia, although that was also a symbol of Roman authority. But Pilate wouldn't have wanted to be in a drafty old barracks, fortress. He would have been naturally in the Hasmonean Palace, and especially remember that Jesus is sent from him to Herod Antipas. He certainly would have been in the Hasmonean Palace as well. So that's where the royalty would have been. And the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is located right outside the old city gates. Now, in this model, you say, wait a minute, that's still within the city gates. But that northern part of the city, those walls weren't built until 66 A.D., long after the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. So that northern location, that location of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, is very close to where the Hasmonean Palace would have been, where the trials would have taken place. In contrast to that, Gordon's Calvary and Gordon's tomb, because there's a tomb right nearby too, is way on the north side of the city, far removed from either the Fortress Antonia, but especially far removed from the Hasmonean Palace. So that probably, not that it really matters, but probably is not where it took place. Of course, the real thing, and this what we're looking here is just a picture of the first century tomb. The important thing is not where Jesus died, was buried, and rose again, but that he did die, and why he died and was buried. And of course, that was to be a payment for our sins, to be a substitute for us, to die in our place, and that he was buried and that he rose again. So that's the real message of the Bible. The Bible doesn't make a big deal about where those locations were, doesn't try to describe them, but the fact that he did die and was certainly dead and buried, and that he rose and was seen by many, and that he lives again.